Hello, Los Angeles. Hello, California. Hello, America. Hello, world. Welcome to the broadcast. This is Politics with Roger. I'm Roger. This is where we love to discuss politics. This is a weekly summary show of the news and competing news narratives that we see both out of the corporate media and from independent media. Thanks again for tuning in. So much going on. Well, if you're like me, if you enjoy or promote libertarian principles, if you support the Make America Great Again movement, if you support constitutionalism, then you have been having a great year, a great month, and guess what? We had another great week. Last week, and I don't typically title the broadcast, but last week, just because of the theme that was going on, a narrative-driven week when I said basically the empire had struck back. You had seen the leftist, the mainstream media, not just the leftist media, but corporate mainstream media and popular culture going into overdrive, doing what they can to basically make the impeachment or the removal of our president Donald Trump a possibility or a reality. And we'll cover this in just a second, where we've seen all these different attempts by the Democrat Party, some actors and operatives in the Republican Party, and again in our corporate media and elsewhere, spreading propaganda to create the conditions that would make it possible to remove President Trump. The title of this week's broadcast, or if I did title all my broadcasts, the theme of this week's broadcast is that really all they got? We were expecting, and I told you last week they'd be throwing everything at us. Us being the liberty movement, the libertarian movement, the MAGA movement, they'd be throwing everything, including the kitchen sink, at us because we've seen gradually over the course of the year, the previous government, the previous what we called the establishment, get weaker and weaker as time has gone on. And the more time President Trump has been president, the stronger he gets, the more support he continues to garner. Now, I know if you only consume corporate media, you're probably thinking, what is this guy talking about? Well, this is why this show is here, because there are two competing narratives. There's the narrative that is distributed by corporate mainstream media, and then there's the news that is reported in the independent media. I just basically expose my own biases, but more than anything here, we are searching for the truth, because that is more important than anything, that we just understand what is truly going on. But that being said, is that really all they got? Was that all that the corporate media had in the deep state? Because we are seeing frequently these media frenzies, these breathless media attacks orchestrated, when you see it with the same outlets reporting the same talking points, their power in the mainstream media is getting weaker and weaker with every passing day, every passing week. And the media frenzies that used to be very effective in either getting people to resign or getting Republicans or certain politicians to capitulate to them, it simply isn't working anymore. And if you're like me, and you're supporting the Make America Great Again movement, these are very good days. I say a constant theme of this show since it began, and I'll just repeat it quickly. We are ending an era that I would call the age of misinformation. I thought that I had been growing up in the age of information. That's what people told me my entire life. But I say that we've been living in an era of cognitive dissonance, an era of suspended disbelief that began in 1963 when that bullet left John F. Kennedy's brain and left his head. We've been living in an era of misinformation ever since then, but we are breaking that thanks to independent media. When I say independent media, I don't mean me, but the blogosphere and just people out there reporting news as independent media. And that's what's going on. So mainstream media in free fall, no longer effective. The political evidence is that the Democrat Party is in disarray. We're going to get to that in just a minute. Our Make America Great Again movement is surging. Thank you, Jesus. Anyway, we'll start off with the Michael Flynn, Russia, the whole Russian collusion narrative that is being pushed by our mainstream media for the last 14 months. things are getting more and more clear every day. I'll just start with last Friday when we did the broadcast. By the way, it's about 3:15 here in Los Angeles. Last Friday, as we were reporting, the ABC News and Brian Ross had reported that Michael Flynn had agreed to cooperate with the FBI and was going to testify that Donald Trump had ordered him to contact the Russians as a candidate. By the time I went to bed Friday night, after the broadcast last Friday, ABC had already retracted that story and walked it back. It turns out that Michael Flynn was ordered to speak to the Russians after Donald Trump was elected. That is called normal behavior from governments, and it was basically a non-story. But Brian Ross has since been suspended for 1 month. He was just a fall guy. I think he knew the moment he reported the news that it was fake news, that it was political in nature, and it was part of an orchestrated, again, media hit, media frenzy that the mainstream media is so famous for, and it just basically blew up in their face because, it was exposed within 24 hours. All they really managed to do was, create a ripple in the stock market that temporarily brought it down. It's not accurate to call it a crash, but I'll say just currently crashed the market for 1 day with the fake news that was reported by Brian Ross. It was a total embarrassment to ABC. Culturally, and many of you probably already seen this video of Joy Behar in The View gleefully reporting this fake news, celebrating the idea that our president might be breaking the law and might soon be arrested and kicked out of office. I encourage you to net search Joy Behar, The View celebrates Donald Trump, and the ABC News story. Just totally embarrassing. Anyway, they all had to retract that by Tuesday of the following week or Tuesday of this week. And just, again, more evidence that the corporate mainstream media, the power, their influence is they've destroyed all their credibility, and it's almost at the point where they have no credibility, no influence whatsoever, except with their own audience, who I don't know if we'll ever, get the memo or even want to wake up from all the fake news that is coming from these outlets. The other part of this is now you start to see the Republicans and officials in our government starting to scrutinize more the FBI. The FBI is losing credibility, as they should, because the FBI has been involved in a lot of shenanigans. You see that earlier this week, Chuck Grassley in front of Congress was testifying, and people are asking questions about what is going on with the FBI. And when we say the FBI, we're not referring to the average agents out there risking their lives, defending our country, a lot of patriots in the FBI. We're talking about the leadership in the FBI. If you want me to be more specific, we're talking about, at this point, Robert Mueller, James Comey, their relationship with the Clinton Foundation, their relationship with the Department of Justice, the Obama administration's Department of Justice, and this whole Russian collusion narrative and fake news, this manufactured fake news, is just blowing up in their face. Now, it's a little hard to explain to people, but basically this whole Russian collusion narrative was built on a fake dossier that was basically purchased by the Democrat National Committee. This dossier was then leaked or given over to John McCain, who leaked the dossier to the FBI and the DOJ. Both of these entities used this fake dossier to conduct illegal surveillance of the president and for the FISA court warrants. And this is what, for all year the mainstream media was just reporting and gleefully reporting, oh, they got warrants out on the president, basically reporting wrongdoing by the president when there was none. Now, they did use this fake dossier to surveil the president and the people that he is in communication with, hoping to find some kind of crime, any kind of crime, because we already know that if the Democrat Party or the mainstream media who hate this president, and this would also include many establishment Republicans who we're still trying to throw out of our government, if they had anything on Donald Trump, they would certainly use it against him any way they can for his impeachment and his removal. But they found nothing, and now the credibility of the FBI is in serious question, and I'm predicting that there's going to be some serious reform there. So anyway, with the collapse of this Russian collusion narrative, you're now seeing the mainstream media, Democrat elected officials shifting, and they've been kind of telegraphing this for a few months also, but now they're really kicking into hyperdrive the narrative that Donald Trump is unfit to serve because of some kind of condition like dementia or Alzheimer's. And they are repeating and repeating and repeating this talking point over and over and over, hoping it gains traction so that they can now attempt to remove the president under the authority of the 25th Amendment. So I'm just, this is why we have this broadcast. I want, all my audience to look out for that. This was actually something that was predicted by Roger Stone way back in May of this year. So we knew it was coming. They got as much out of the Russian collusion narrative as they thought they could. They strung it out all the way, and it just didn't work. And now they're going to pivot to this narrative that the 25th president, the 45th president Donald Trump is unfit to serve, and they must remove him via the 25th Amendment. So anyway. Oh, and one more thought about that. Someone who has been promoting this narrative, Joe Scarborough of MSNBC, has become completely unhinged in the last couple of weeks. I mean, the guy's always seemed a little unhinged. That's kind of a joke because we can have disagreements in politics. But Donald Trump about 2 weeks ago had mentioned an investigation. Turns out a intern ended up dead in Joe Scarborough's office when he was in Congress in 2001. And Trump had suggested perhaps opening up that investigation, which I think is a great idea because, again, like I said last week, I don't know how interns just end up dead in a congressman's office with their brains bashed in, but that's what happened to Joe Scarborough's intern. And ever since Trump brought this up, Scarborough has completely lost his mind. I mean, he has just turned the dial all the way up. Completely unhinged on his television program with Mika Brzezinski, using rhetoric that the noose is tightening around the president's neck and that he's going to be going to jail for the rest of his life. In both instances, I think demonstrating symptoms of classic projection is Joe Scarborough. And we got our eyes on you, Mr. Scarborough. We're not going to let this go here. And on social media, I know that people are buzzing about it all the time now. I think you definitely have to investigate what's going on in Congress, just like all these sexual assault and rape and all these other allegations have been covered up for years, as we're now finding out. What else has been covered up? So interesting story there. Moving forward, we're getting to multiple Democrat Party fails over the last week, indicating again that our movement, the Make America Great Again movement, the Drain the Swamp movement, is really just wildly successful in the first year and just gaining speed all the time. John Conyers, congressman from Michigan, longtime congressman, I think over 30, 40 years, off the top of my head, resigning due to sexual assault allegations and other things. Just one thought about him. I'm not sure if he knows how a democracy or a republic works, our constitutional democratic republic. He made comments that he would be leaving his seat to his son. Somebody please explain to Mr. Conyers that we do not live in a monarchy. And even if we did, it turns out that his son was also recently arrested for domestic abuse problems. Headline reading that he actually stabbed his girlfriend. So, I mean, he's not a public official yet, or should never be, I mean, unless the people of Michigan decide to elect him. But that's John Conyers on his way out trying to put his son into his seat, which isn't the way this government's supposed to work. And even if it did, his son is still unfit. But anyway, that's John Conyers. Luis Gutierrez of Illinois retiring this week under suspicions, it looks like, of corruption. Again, it looks like he was dipping in the campaign fund and paying his wife big bucks. So Luis Gutierrez quietly retired and said he will not be seeking re-election and will not be staying in politics. I think that's a good move on his part. But again, just more draining the swamp. Also, Al Franken in the news. Under a lot of pressure to resign. He did put out a statement that he would be resigning. He didn't resign immediately, so, in the right-wing blogosphere and social media, many are suspecting that Al Franken is just simply hedging his bets against the outcome of Roy Moore. And if Roy Moore gets elected, Al Franken would probably withdraw his quote-unquote resignation. So, people are just playing games there, but Al Franken is very, very weak at this point either way. It'd just be a miracle if he won re-election, because people in Minnesota aren't that, I don't think the people of Minnesota will buy it. Al Franken out there announcing his resignation, and we'll see what happens with him. And speaking of Democrat fails also, there's been a consistent drumbeat of the mainstream media calling Roy Moore a pedophile, calling Roy Moore all sorts of different names. This is the Republican senatorial candidate in Alabama. Turns out just today, one of his accusers, represented by Gloria Allred, which should always be a red flag at this point if Gloria Allred is representing somebody, turns out forged the dates and other elements of the yearbook evidence that she had presented. So again, Democrats going on full offensive. The Empire struck back last week, really going for it on every end, turning it up in the media, turning it up in their attacks, and just falling pathetically short in everything that they're attempting and their attempts to deceive the American public. Roy Moore held strong. We'll see if he wins his election next week. And then finally, just to add more insult to injury for the Democrat Party, Representative Al Green brought a bill to the floor to impeach Donald Trump, and that was defeated with ease. Everything that the Democrats are trying, just blowing up in their face and making them look stupid in the process. Look, I'm being hard on the Democratic Party right now. We burned down our own Republican Party during the primary of 2016. So it's not just partisan. We just want our government to work for us again. This is why we're draining the swamp. So just moving forward now, the MAGA movement had a lot of victories this week. You see the Trump presidency just moving along, operating very, very well and having victory after victory. What do I mean by that? Well, we got tax cuts passed through the House last week. I'm not going to comment on the effect those are going to have. I mean, I suspect this is going to be a good thing for our economy, which is already, by the way, roaring along with jobs up. The Dow Jones, again, up very high. Now, I'm always very cautious to give the president a lot of credit for the economy early, because if the economy were to collapse, then then he'd also be to blame. People need to realize that we doubled the national debt in 8 years with George W. Bush, from something like 4 trillion to 8 trillion. And then Obama in the next 8 years doubled it again from 8 trillion to over 19 trillion. So, when we're talking about that much debt in that short a time, it does leave the economy in a very unstable position. So while things are going very good for the Trump economy, which we're glad about, and it's still a very precarious position to be in because of all the debt and the possibility of currency being devalued and all these other kind of economic issues that are going around. We won't get into that too much right now, but we are seeing good news in the economy. It's always a good thing to see American companies returning to America, giving American citizens jobs, and giving people here in America the opportunity to increase their incomes, increase their wealth, and that helps everybody at home. That's what it means to make America great again. That's what it means to put America and Americans first. NAFTA, I saw a headline this week that NAFTA is being renegotiated, and that is all part of this good news. And just something else I want to throw in here, the whole idea with Bitcoin. Bitcoin is surging as a currency, and while I'm not going to promote Bitcoin as an investment in itself, it is very good that other currencies are popping up as a hedge against basically the banking system that we have in our country that is controlled by our Federal Reserve, which, by the way, is a private entity that is not controlled by our government. Not a lot of people know that, but that is true. So to see other currencies starting to gain strength and authority and influence in our economy is a healthy thing. Now, does that mean that Bitcoin is going to be sticking around as the currency of choice for everybody? I don't know. It's having a really great run, and a lot of people are saying it's going to continue to have a great run. But other currencies could pop up, other situations could present themselves. So I'm not willing to say right here and now that Bitcoin is here forever. But Bitcoin's having a great run. And the great thing about Bitcoin is it is a hedge against our Federal Reserve banking system, which needs to have some competition simply for the fact that I definitely know that our banking system, our Federal Reserve, is in a bubble. That's what happens when you accumulate $20 trillion in debt. So to see other currencies competing with our national banking system is a good thing. So we'll see what happens with Bitcoin in the future. Another political victory for the Trump administration this week was the Supreme Court has upheld Donald Trump's travel ban to 7 Muslim countries. Off the top of my head, Libya, the Sudan, Yemen, Iraq, Syria. I think I already said Iran. Nope, now I'm going to double up. Well, I'll just have to post it up here. 7 Muslim countries where we know there are a lot of Wahhabi Sunni Muslims. They called them refugees, and they brought them over and dropped them off who knows where in our country. The Supreme Court has upheld Donald Trump's travel ban. The original refugee program, which is still existing in Europe, I've been telling you, is part of a globalist destabilization program against the West, that these people that are being brought in from other countries are not refugees, but rather invaders dressed up as a humanitarian crisis. So I caution Americans to be very careful about this. It's a huge victory to have the Supreme Court uphold this ban. And just one more thought about that. I know that as we're securing the border, talk about the Dreamers Act and deportation is really starting to heat up. I would suggest that before we even talk about the Dreamers here in America, that we make sure that we deport all the quote-unquote refugees that were brought over, particularly after 2014 or particularly after 2012 during the Obama administration. We don't know who they are, where they are, what their intentions are, and they were brought in very quickly, and this is why the travel ban came on. And by the way, this was all done by executive order, which is not constitutional to begin with. That's why I support this action by Donald Trump, who basically just reversed an executive order with an executive order. So that's what's going on. The Supreme Court upheld the travel ban by Donald Trump, a huge victory, not just for the Trump administration, which isn't the most important thing, but a huge victory for America, because we need to secure our borders and understand who we're bringing into this country. Now the big story, could have led off with this, but I wanted to save it for last. Jerusalem, Donald Trump this week had announced that the American embassy in Tel Aviv will be moved to the capital of Israel. which is Jerusalem. And this is recognition from America that Jerusalem is the capital of Israel, which is a very significant event, if anything, just because the Muslim world, the Arab and Shiite Muslim world, basically has been bullying America out of making this recognition, basically since Jerusalem, or since the inception of Israel as a state. Previous presidents had promised, George W. Bush, Barack Obama, both promised to move the embassy to Jerusalem. Neither of those presidents fulfilled their promises, but Donald Trump has fulfilled this promise. Now, predictably, the Muslim world, or actors in the Muslim world, had come out and said that this political move, which was a provocative move, would create endless war and terrorism, and it would create a caliphate throughout the Muslim world. To which I would say, so what? What would that change? Radical Islamists have been basically threatening war threatening terrorism and threatening killing Westerners in times of peace and in times of war. So I'm not sure what these threats would change today. And I want to focus just for a second on the president of Turkey, Recep Tayyip Erdogan, who was very adamant about this, and basically he came out and said that this would again create a situation where Muslims would respond and attack. And what I'm analyzing here is that Erdogan is on his last legs in Turkey, and that he is trying to solidify his position as a leader in the Sunni Islamist Muslim world, and try to rally basically his people, his movement, which are basically radical Islamists who are also Sunni Muslims. Now, to explain a little bit of the background, Turkey during the Bush years was becoming, was getting closer to the West at least, and NATO brought them into, Turkey was brought into NATO, and it seemed like Turkey was moving more towards moderation and moving away from radical Islam. But since the Arab Spring in 2010, you've seen Turkey take a really strong slide towards radical Islam and terror. Turkey was used as a conduit to allow who knows how many refugees from the Muslim and Arab world into Europe, as Erdogan simply allowed people to pass through Turkey into European countries. And also Erdogan had solidified his power in Turkey by staging a false flag coup against himself in 2014 and then cracking down on all his political enemies shortly thereafter, really finishing the slide into total totalitarianism. Now, Erdogan has seen his political fortunes take a 180 since the election of Donald Trump, starting with the elimination of ISIS, the radical Islamist Sunni Wahhabi army that was basically a proxy army for Saudi Arabia and Turkey that took over Libya, dominated Egypt, dominated Iraq, and then tried to take over Syria. ISIS has been completely ravaged and destroyed since the election of Donald Trump, and now Erdogan is sitting in Turkey in a much weaker position than he was a year ago. We just saw Saudi Arabia go through a violent coup where the new king and Prince King Salman has made a pivot towards moderation, has made a pivot away from radical Islamic terror. And I'm sure Erdogan is watching this in horror because he is next. In Turkey, I would just say that I would imagine, I'm not an expert in politics in Turkey, but I would imagine his position is very weak right now. We saw a revolution in Iran in, I think, 2009, 2010, where the populations of these countries want to move away from radical Islam. They want to have prosperity. They want to have liberty, just like we have in the West. And the dictators in those countries have kept these people down. Obama did not support the people in Iran during the uprising that happened, and they were able to put it down. I think Turkey and Iran are both very close, again, to similar revolutions, particularly in Turkey, which is why I think you see Erdogan trying to make a stand with radical Islamists and using this event in Jerusalem to basically rally the troops. Now, I told you last week that many conflicts are coming, and this is one of those conflicts. I completely support the president in this action because basically we have to confront these movements that are trying to confront the West. Jerusalem is the capital of Israel. Israel is its own country, and it's really no other country's business what capital city Israel chooses to make its capital. And to be bullied out of it at the threat of war only invites more terrorism, more demands, and it's just time that the West takes a stand, and that's what we're doing here. It may lead to some violence, it may lead to some skirmishes, but if left unchecked, we're just going to invite more terrorism. So great move by the president. Thank you for keeping up with your fulfilling his campaign promises. And despite the political pressures and despite all the chatter, we're going to hold through with this. And I think in the end, you're not going to see nearly as much violence as being threatened or promised by Tayyip Erdogan or by our mainstream media or some of the critics of this choice. And finally, I just want to touch on a couple stories. We're not going to touch on this long. They're not as important, but first, there was an article today, this is from the area of culture. Apparently, 25% of millennials would prefer to have sexual relations with dolls or blow-up dolls or these robots or synthetic robots that are now basically hitting the market and becoming a part of our society. My thought on that is get away from this as soon as possible. If you're men, men or women, when the male versions come along. I mean, a quick thought to myself is, and I also think pornography kind of goes hand in hand with this too, and we need to have a little bit of a cultural change in this, or at least a discussion, because this is, the growth of the sex industry is an assault on the nuclear family, is an assault on traditional values. And you might think, hey, so what? What do I care? Well, if you're gonna be 65 years old, you might wake up someday, if you're a man and you're into all this stuff, you might wake up someday 65 years old, childless, and with a doll or robot as a girlfriend. And I might suggest to you that that's the road to bitterness. So it's just something to look out for. But anyway, that's all I want to say about that. And finally, a lot of you heard there are fires in Los Angeles all week. They're all around me here. I'm located in Van Nuys. My only thought is, thank God for the firefighters, working hard to put those out. And it did throw this city into some chaos, and it was like raining ashes all week. And, I could tell you some interesting stories some other time about, some things that you'd see. But I'm also a little bit suspicious about the number of fires and the different locations. Now, I'm not going to go too far with my speculation. I mean, I think you all understand the implication that these fires may have been started. I know we had fires in Northern California that we did find out were the works of arsonists, and it basically went unreported. So, I'm cynical basically, again, because of all the different locations that these fires popped up. And then people are going to say, well, what about the winds? The winds. Well, I've lived in this city since 2001. We do have strong winds that consistently show up. They call them the Santa Ana winds. They usually show up in late September and October, and the weather is much hotter at that time. I mean, this week was still reasonably cool, 60s, 70s, and maybe into the 80s during the hottest parts of the day. When the Santa Ana winds blow in September and October, I mean, it gets to 90 and above 100 degrees. And I've never seen this many, we'll have forest fires, definitely we'll have brush fires, but never this many and never in different locations. So I'm being purely speculative, but I just wanted to throw that out there. And since the Los Angeles fires were a big story, I just wanted to point that out. But anyway, thank you very much for tuning in, everybody. That's the scoop from this week, and we'll be seeing you next week. God bless.